I want to take the first minute of my presentation for a word of gratitude to the John Templeton Foundation. I was one of the first group of winners of the Theological Award, Templeton Award for Theological Promise 5 years ago in 2007. And I remember the occasion well, the recognition that you spoke of, Professor Stievermann, in the celebration at the Alte Aula in Heidelberg, but also the widening of my horizon during the lectures that took place in the 2 years after I received the award in far-flung places like Trondheim, Norway, Debrecen, Hungary, Taipei in Taiwan, but also Stellenbosch, which really showed, but they were not only trips to far-flung places, but also had an influence in my formation as a theologian, because they strengthened my conviction to remain a dogmatic theologian, which is not as self-evident in a German theological context as it is in other contexts. I was amazed at how dogmatic theology can bridge the differences between cultures, and how I can talk to Presbyterians from Taipei, and we can talk about the image of God, for example, and have a constructive dialogue. So this is just extra obligo. Now let's take another excursion into the peculiar logic of the Austrian mind. God's spirituality, the Trinitarian dynamics of prayer. Maybe I should have rather called my paper an Augustinian perspective on the science and religion dialogue, because what I did here is I took my beginning at the work that was awarded, the Templeton Prize, my dissertation about prayer, and then I asked myself, why should I, as a dogmatician, engage in a dialogue with scientists? And I think there is a theological reason, which I would like to present to you in the next few minutes. So I'll begin with just a short introduction into my thought about prayer. The embodiment of prayer: praise, petition, lament, and thanksgiving. Prayer articulates the community between God and human. In prayer, faith becomes word. On the basis of the biblical prayer traditions, I delineated the grammar of prayer as interplay of praise, petition, thanksgiving, and lament. These four elements are not isolated from each other, but are interconnected. They form a configuration: praise, petition, lament, and thanksgiving. Their specific configuration is rooted in the specific community with God, in the relationship between the believer and God, and, of course, in the specific situation of the praying person. Every individually spoken prayer is rooted in this specific configuration of thanksgiving, praise, petition, and lament. But, of course, each individual prayer applies these four elements and their configuration to a given situation of the praying person. So the individual prayer moves within the deep framework of the biblical tradition, thus placing the individually praying person in a chorus and the tradition of prayers. So the grammar of prayer, of course, is the grammar of faithful existence. As the grammar of prayer, the configuration of praise, petition, thanksgiving, and lament expresses the deepest structure of faithful life in the world. So it might be the case that interpreting this configuration of thanksgiving, lament, praise, and petition, there might be a road of access to the Christian existence as such. And I do not want to turn my back on other ways of interpreting the human Christian existence, for example, the duality of freedom and obedience, or by way of the duality between the existence coram mundo in the world and coram Deo before God. But I do want to argue that the grammar of praise, petition, lament, and thanksgiving offers a fresh perspective on how we perceive of the Christian existence. So I already spoke of this pattern and configuration of the four elements. the most fundamental characteristic of the configuration of the four, thanksgiving, praise, lament, and petition, is the relationship and combination of praise and petition. Praise and petition together form the heart of Christian prayer. And in this position, I combine two influential approaches to prayer. The first, on the one hand, is the doxological approach, which may be connected with John Calvin, who says that all life is a glorification of God and puts prayer in the context of this fundamental conviction. So prayer as well has the aim of praising God, doxological approach. On the other hand, there's the petitionary approach, which might be addressed in the theology of Karl Barth, who stresses that all human life, in essence, ought to be obedient to God, and of course, this implies that petition is in the purest form of prayer. Especially, so the purest petition would be, "Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." I want to combine those two approaches, doxological and petitionary. They belong together and form the heart of Christian prayer. If one of them is pushed to the background, then Christian prayer atrophies or weakens. It loses its connection to thanksgiving and to lament. So, I noted that the grammar of prayer is the grammar of faithful existence, a standing point for looking into the deepest structures of faithful life in the world. As such, as the grammar of faithful existence, prayer is a look into the image of God within human life. So the second step I want to take today, and I hope you are willing to go with me on this dogmatic short journey, is a short reflection about the image of God, imago Dei, in the human mind. Yeah, of course, we all are familiar with the old theological notion that the human being is the image of God, which has been developed from Genesis 1:27. In my approach to this problem, I draw on Augustine, on Augustine's position in this matter. In his work, De Trinitate, Augustine offers an interpretation of the human being as the image of God. For Augustine, any true image of God can only be Trinitarian, because God is the living unity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Here I do not want and cannot go into detail with regard to Augustine's search for images of the Trinity in the human mind. I simply want to draw on one Augustinian motive in order to further my present argument. This Augustinian motive is the following idea: the life of the human mind is an interaction between memory, intelligence, and will, memoria, intelligentia, and voluntas. Each of these three has its own way of operating, memory, intelligence, and will, but only in their cooperation are they the fullness of the human mind, and in some interactions they become the image of God, according to Augustine. Whenever the mind is at work, there's an interaction between memory, intelligence, and voluntas, a will. But only when the mind is moved by the love of God, says Augustine, only then, when the love of God is present in the human mind, then the living image of God is being created. Only when the human mind receives the Holy Spirit, the band of love, vinculum caritatis, the human mind becomes the true image of God. When the mind is moved by the love of God, memory, intelligence, and will interact in a specific manner, loving God and loving the neighbor. For Augustine, this is an eschatological occurrence. It is not a realistic, or it's not something that can be fully realized in the human existence as it is now. Augustine is quite pessimistic regarding our present capability to be images of God. But still, by the presence of the Holy Spirit, the believing mind perceives also the relationality within God, between Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Okay, by understanding the faithful human mind as a configuration of intelligence, memory, and will, led by the Holy Spirit, the approach to prayer is now modified. Prayer emerges as a complex realization of several layers of relationships. First, the interplay of memory, will, and intelligence. It is I who pray with my mind, using my faculties, memory, intelligence, and will. Second, the working of the Holy Spirit within this mind that forms the thoughts and the life of my mind in accordance with the love of God. And third, the articulation of the relational web within God Himself. But I do not want to speak about theosis, but it's Third, God's spirituality. I'm already bridging over into the last paragraph. What I want to say is, I want to move away from this I-thou relationship between the praying person and God. It's not a theistic understanding of God, but a Trinitarian understanding of God, which means an involved presence of God. God's spirituality. Now let me draw my conclusion, as far as I can conclude. First, I delineated for you the two approaches to prayer, the doxological and the petitionary approach, as I named them. And I said the two approaches need to be combined. Praise and petition both are the heart of Christian prayer. Then I sketched the image of God in the believing mind, taking my cue from Augustine and Calvin. So the human mind becomes the living image of God by being endowed with God's love. This endowment is the presence of the Holy Spirit in the heart of the believer. If I may speak in more biblical terms at one moment. By this love, memory, intelligence, and will within the human being begin to interact in a new way, living out the image of God. And, living out the image of God in love of God and love of neighbor. So now let me combine the two steps and shortly sketch how this may be a stepping stone for an interdisciplinary dialogue within dogmatics, as a stepping stone from the heart of dogmatics itself. I understand praise and petition as human responses to the presence of the Holy Spirit. These responses are not independent of the Holy Spirit, but filled with it. Praise is then the human response to being drawn into the love of God. And petition is the human response to being drawn into love of neighbor. Praise realizes the reciprocity of love between God and the believer. Fulfillment, reciprocity of love. Praise is the awareness that the Holy Spirit is the opening of the community of love between the Father and the Son. The counterpart of praise is lament, of course. Lament realizes the loneliness between God and the believer. Lament is an awareness of difference and of Christ's cry of abandonment on the cross. Petition, as I hinted at before, is the human response to being drawn into the love of neighbor. Petition realizes that God's love leads into love of neighbor. It leads into the community of believers. And it leads into community with the world. In this perspective, intercession may be the purest form of petition. Intercession. And the counterpart of petition, of course, is thanksgiving. Thanksgiving, gratitude, is the awareness of received gifts, that is the awareness of the Holy Spirit's work on the believer and on the believing community. So petition and thanksgiving are introductions into the relationship between the Holy Spirit and Christ, if I say this very abbreviated. Yeah, just 2 sentences left. one question, one sentence. How can praise and petition be interpreted in terms of the interplay of memory, intelligence, and will? Human responses, petition, praise, so there must be an interplay of memory, intelligence, and will. I think here lies a theological reason to engage with scientific interpretations of the human mind. But this reasoning remains true to the otherness of the faith discourse, that is, to the fundamental theological distinction between creation and creator. Thank you.
Any discussion? We didn't plan any discussion for the first evening, and also this unit is without discussions. I know that many of you will ask, why shouldn't we have? There are very rich contributions here. We could have had a whole day with these presentations. Dr. Monteano almost presented a book project. So you see the richness, very different styles of thinking, very different faith traditions, very different disciplines. And these were only 4 of 60 voices. So we tried to present you interesting selection in terms of also international stance, and we could have presented many, many more. So I think this shows you what really was a fantastic achievement.